ارفع ايدك في السماء واطلب من عند ربي الاستغلال التام الشعب الصحراوي.
All right. Hello. Welcome to Rising with the Tide podcast. This is episode 37, I think. It's been a while. Welcome back, everyone. We've had streaming on for a while, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, you are currently listening to a Zoom, an old school Zoom episode.
Skander dropped his router on the floor.
Basically, the copper cables in my current housing shelter do not support streaming, but it's fine. We'll be back into it in probably in a couple of weeks. So maybe not the episode after this, but the episode after that should be streaming. I know how people miss us streaming. They really don't. No one watches the streams, but it makes us happy when there's one person in the chat that asks a question. You know,
yeah, then it's worth it. It's worth it.
We both cry inside a little bit. We're like, yes, amazing. But yeah. So without further ado, today we are having Dr. Joanna Allan, senior lecturer at Northumbria, the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences. She holds a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship and has been doing work on everything from wind imaginaries to poetry to colonialism even, and everything in between. And we're super excited to talk to you today. Welcome on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me and for your interest in my work.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving us a bit of your time. I know that as we've discussed privately with you before, things are there's never enough time, and I'm sure with the strikes and everything, it's a bit tough. So I guess we can start maybe with quickly going over this, something we'd like to do in general, but to go over the beginnings of your career as a researcher and how you came to be interested in, the Sahara mostly, I guess, which is kind of a big part of your research nowadays, but also just in generally the topics that we will discuss soon after.
Okay, yeah. I guess to go back to the beginning, it would be my undergraduate studies. So I studied Hispanic studies, mostly Spanish and Latin American literature, film, history, politics, a bit of a mix in my particular degree. But just by coincidence, we had one lecturer who focused on Western Sahara, which was one of Spain's two former African colonies. And I remember at the time, I was really surprised to hear about the situation in Western Sahara. As an undergraduate student, I like to think I was quite in the know about international issues. I was involved in lots of societies, we call them in UK academia, student societies, activist ones, and so on. And it surprised me to hear about this conflict that I'd never heard of. And I was in my second year at university by then, and I had no idea that Spain had any colonies in Africa by my second year into a Hispanic studies degree. So that was quite shocking that I didn't know about that, or I hadn't made the effort to find out as well, you could say. So that sparked my interest. I did a year abroad in Spain, as is normal in a Hispanic studies degree. And on my year abroad, I found out that there are hundreds of Spaniards who go to the Saharawi refugee camps in Algeria every year to run a marathon. So I suppose we'll get on to the topic of why there are Sahrawi refugees in Algeria. But anyway,
and the improbable concept of a marathon in a refugee camp.
Yeah, that's true as well. Yeah. So this was a chance for me to visit the camps, and I wanted to do my dissertation on gender relations in Sahrawi society. So yeah, basically that I've found an opportunity to go there and do some research during my undergraduate dissertation. And then I did a master's after that, and then I worked in NGOs and the public sector for a few years, in various different jobs, mostly research and advocacy jobs, doing research and using it for lobbying for different causes. And in my free time, I volunteered with Western Sahara Campaign, which is a UK-based solidarity group with the Sahrawi people, and also with Western Sahara Resource Watch, which is a network of solidarity activists and Sahrawis living in the diaspora, some Sahrawis living in Western Sahara as well. So I volunteered with these organisations in my free time. And eventually I decided to do a PhD, and I had this interest in the case of the Sahara, but also wanted to do something new. So I ended up doing my PhD comparing histories of women's resistance movements in Equatorial Guinea and Western Sahara. And in terms of energy, because I'd been volunteering with Western Sahara Resource Watch for so many years, so we, again, I suppose we'll come to talk about the Western Sahara conflict a bit, but for now to say it's a country that is at war at the moment. Western Sahara, most of it is occupied by another country. Lots of Sahrawis see their natural resources as the reason why they were colonized by Spain, and why they're still under a military occupation today. And energy resources are a key part of this. So my interest in energy stems from there, I suppose. And also one of my day jobs was in National Energy Action, which is a charity campaigning on behalf of the fuel poor, the energy poor. So for lower energy prices, better housing stock in Britain, that plays such a role in energy efficiency, and better living wages, I suppose. So these sort of three issues. So again, this fed my interest in energy, I suppose, and that's where it came from, really.
Yeah. Maybe before we get into the research that you have done yourself, I have to say, Jamie and I, we very quickly discussed this earlier, but we know extremely little. Even honestly, that's even an overstatement, about the Sahrawi people, Western Sahara, and just any kind of conflict going on between Morocco and Western Sahara. So if you could, enlighten us even just a little bit about the basics of the conflict. I like to think our listeners are very, very smart people, but but yeah, no, like you said, it's a very it's slightly underrepresented conflict. So yeah, I agree, and it's completely not normal not to know a lot. It's very rarely in media in the global north. It's rarely on academic syllabuses for, well, as I said, for Hispanic studies, but in Arabic studies or North Africa area studies, it doesn't often feature. So it's normal that people don't know about it. Western Sahara was, to go back in history, I suppose, where the conflict comes from, it was a Spanish colony. So in the 1884 Berlin Conference, when the powers of Europe decided to divide up Africa between themselves, what today is called Western Sahara became Spanish Sahara and was handed to the Spanish, basically. And they eventually began to settle there, not really until the 40s and 50s. But in 1947, Spanish geologists found phosphates deposits and evidence that there was probably oil there. So this sort of pushed the Spanish government to settle in this colony, basically. So right from the start, as in the case of other colonies, I suppose, it's about resources and exploitation. In the case of Western Sahara, phosphates first and foremost. So
Phosphates are needed in agricultural fertilizers, so they're integral to our current global food system, which made phosphates very lucrative for the Spanish. They built a phosphates mine near the country's capital, Aeolian, or they dug a phosphates mine, I should say. And this is still one of the world's first sources of phosphates. So when we get to the 1970s, most African countries have won their independence, and Spain's under a lot of pressure to decolonize because they haven't decolonized Spanish Sahara, obviously. And the dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, was in a coma in 1975 on his deathbed. Right. And the government, rather than decolonize following the usual UN process for decolonization, instead negotiated agreements with the neighboring Morocco and Mauritania, illegal agreements. These were called the Madrid Accords. And so through the Madrid Accords, Spain agreed to hand over Western Sahara, half of it to Morocco, half of it to Mauritania. And in exchange, Spain would get the UN efforts back, but it would also get a continued 35% share in profits from the phosphate mine. And also they'd have continued access to Western Sahara's very rich fisheries. So going back centuries and centuries, fishermen from the Canary Islands have fished in Western Sahara's waters. It's an important source for Spain for its fish. So this was an important economic consideration as well. So they pretty much literally sold off their colony.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I just want to ask, does Western Sahara have kind of an identity as a nation or as a people? Like, I guess I'm not sure even if national identity is the right word to use, but at least some form of identity that bonds them together.
Yeah, I mean, they very much do. It's a constructed identity, as are all national identities. But certainly today, they have a very strong national identity. So traditionally, the indigenous people of Western Sahara were nomads. They lived in nomadic tribes, which roamed the territory today called Western Sahara, but also parts of southern Morocco, parts of Western Algeria, and large parts of Mauritania. So culturally, Sahrawis are very similar to Mauritanians. They speak the same dialect of Arabic, Hassaniya. Their traditional dress is the same. There's lots of cultural similarities between Mauritanians and Sahrawis, less so between Sahrawis and Moroccans. And ahead of these 1975 Madrid agreements, Spain was actually thinking about just following the UN process for decolonization. So they did a census of the Sahrawi population in 1974 to decide who would get to vote in a self-determination referendum. And there was also a UN visiting mission in 1975 to get a flavor of this. Is there a Sahrawi nation? Would they want independence and self-rule, or would they rather remain under Spanish governance, or would they want to integrate with Mauritania or Morocco? And the overwhelming consensus of the members in this UN visiting mission, and their conclusion was that Sahrawis were strongly in favor of independence and strongly rejected integration or Spanish rule. So there was a sort of nationalist sentiment from this sort of period onwards. And there'd been movements for independence since the 60s, sort of formal organized movements. So the first one was called Harakat Tahrir, Liberation Movement. That emerged in the 60s. The leader was Mohamed Basiri. And he was in favor of negotiating sort of gradual independence from Spain in partnership with Spain, and to retain some sort of tie afterwards, friendly relations. But he was forcibly disappeared by Spain, along with many of other leaders of the movement. So it became
Right.
clear then to the Sahrawis that they wouldn't get independence by peaceful means. So
Yeah.
they formed a sort of revolutionary armed movement in favor of independence. And this was the Polisario Front, who's still the sort of face of the Sahrawi nationalist movement. So they pursued independence through armed means, sort of through tactics like sabotage the conveyor belt that goes from the phosphate mine to the port, military targets, and so on. So when Morocco and Mauritania invade, it's Polisario who defends the Sahrawis and fights for independence. And the Moroccan and Mauritanian position was that before Western Sahara was a Spanish colony, that this land was terra nullius, that partly terra nullius, but with links to the Moroccan Sultanate on the one hand,
Okay.
and with the Mauritanian entity on the other. So basically, that before the Spain colonized, this territory belonged to Morocco and Mauritania. So their position was that they were getting back what had been theirs.
Right.
And the International Court of Justice, though, Morocco requested that the International Court of Justice consider their position and publish an opinion on it. So this was a sort of way of making legitimate the Madrid Accords, perhaps, and justifying their invasion. But the International Court of Justice, their opinion was the contrary, really. So they concluded that there was no evidence of any tie of the kind that would constitute sovereignty, Moroccan sovereignty or Mauritanian sovereignty, and that the usual process for decolonization should be followed, and that the indigenous Sahrawis had a right to a vote on independence. So,
and I'm guessing that was instantly ignored by
it was,
all
yeah,
parties.
it was ignored. Although if I remember correctly, Hassan II, who was king at the time, he said on television that the court had ruled in his favor. It wasn't a ruling, so it was presented otherwise. But yeah, basically it was ignored because it didn't sort of go that way. So that's where this conflict came from. So in October 1975, Morocco and Mauritania invade from north and south. And there's this curious thing. So if you go into a British well-known bookshop like Waterstones and get a book on history of the Arab world, a generalist book, often if Western Sahara is mentioned at all, the invasion is referred to just by mentioning the Green March. So part of the invasion was a Green March of Moroccan citizens southwards into Western Sahara to reclaim the Sahara. And it was peaceful in the sense that these were unarmed civilians. But this was preceded by Moroccan and Mauritanian armies invading and already slaughtering the population. So it's the history is really invisibilized.
I mean, well, I can't say that I've heard of the Green March even, but yeah, as you said about your student years, it may also be our own lack of like wanting to know about these places. But I wonder how has sorry, I don't want to jump too far ahead in the history if there are very important key events, but I wonder how the situation is, I guess, today, like in modern days. Are we seeing still a colonial relationship?
Yeah. So it's a curious one again. If you look at academic legal studies papers, a lot of legal scholars argue that Western Sahara, it's legally still a Spanish colony because it was never decolonized, but there's not any Spanish presence there. Most of the territory is occupied by Morocco, so about 2/3 of it probably. And the occupied part is separated from the part controlled by Sahrawis by the longest active military wall in the world. And the part controlled by Sahrawis, it's really heavily landmined. And they've been trying to remove mines since 1991, but there's just millions of them. So there's not a big Sahrawi population in the Sahrawi controlled part of Western Sahara, basically. Although I don't think anyone knows exactly what the population is, but there's probably a few dozen thousand nomads that were there until November 2020, when war broke out again, which is another point to highlight, I suppose, in terms of background information. So Polisario was at war with Mauritania till 1979 and with Morocco until 1991. And in 91, the UN declared a ceasefire on the back of a promise of a self-determination referendum on independence for the Sahrawis, which never happened. So from 1991 till November 2020, there was a stalemate, basically, with various plans put forward by the UN and the referendum continuously being blocked. A very long stalemate. And war broke out again in November 2020. So since then, the nomads that had been in the Sahrawi controlled part of Western Sahara, a lot of them have gone back to the refugee camps in southwest Algeria. So yeah,
I guess Algeria really like an ally to the Sahrawi people in this conflict?
It is, yeah. So upon the invasion, Sahrawi refugees, a lot of them fled eastwards within Western Sahara, but their refugee camps were bombed on 4 known occasions with napalm. So they realized that they were never going to be safe in their own country. In Algeria, this was 1975, 1976.
Okay.
So yeah, Algeria offered them asylum in Tindouf, which is a sort of Algerian military outpost. The Sahrawis have got camps there. There's 5 camps. There's about 200,000 people live there.
Is it in Berber territory? Do you know?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay. Just out of curiosity.
I'm not sure. So these are also a state in exile. So in 1976, the Polisario declared these camps a state in exile. And Algeria, it's an ally of the Sahrawis. I think generally the Algerian role is overplayed. Often in the media, it's described, Polisario is described as Algerian-backed, almost as if Algeria and Morocco were the main players, which is really wrong, in my opinion.
Trying to put it off as a proxy war or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And as I've heard, actually, I'm hearing now is the tensions between Morocco and Algeria are all-time high. I have Moroccan friends who are worried actually about being drafted in the coming weeks for a possible conflict between the two, but as if we need that right now in the world. But so I guess maybe it could even be kind of utilized as a sort of argument by one side or the other to facilitate a war if for other reasons. I mean, that they would need want for other reasons.
Certainly.
So I guess this 76 then you were at?
So that's these refugee camps become a state in exile as well as refugee camps. So it's a curious place. All the camps have schools, local councils, there's museums, hospitals, with very well trained, well educated population. So aside from Algeria, Polisario has other allies, mostly in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and they have educational programs with a lot of these countries. So dozens of thousands of Sahrawis have been educated in Cuba, for example. Lots of medicine graduates from Cuba. So there's a very well-trained refugee population, but with very little resources. So they'll have hospitals with lots of great doctors, but hardly any equipment. It's like they have everything you'd expect to find in a normal state, but in very unusual circumstances. Yeah.
So I guess they've would you say that there's kind of self-determination involved in a like local democratic level as well? Like, are they able to impose some kind of, you know, I guess legislative and judicial rule, or are they subject to Algerian laws completely?
They have their own courts. To be honest, I'm not sure what parts of law would remain under Algerian jurisdiction. They have a parliament, national parliament, local councils. There are elections. It's a one-party state, so there's just Polisario candidates on offer. On the other hand, you see really strong elements of direct democracy. So at election time, there's all sorts of mechanisms for the population to make their voice heard and engage with their candidates, and lots of debates and things like that at local council level. And yeah, interesting how it's interesting seeing this in practice, or reading work of others who work more on sort of the political institutions of the Sahrawi Republic. So one thing that always stuck in my mind is how candidates might recite poetry, and this is something that the population will expect that will help decide who to vote for. And yeah, it's,
can't imagine that in the UK. Like,
no, that's right.
About to read some Shakespeare to get elected.
Yeah, it's different, but so it's debatable. That's a question actually I'm doing with my students at the moment on their democracy and democratization module. So looking at what constitutes a democracy. Can we describe the Sahrawi Republic as a democracy or not? And to what extent our understandings of democracy are Eurocentric, and these sorts of discussions. So
that's like incredibly interesting. And following on from that, in your paper Decolonizing Renewable Energy, you speak about how Sahrawi poets use Aeolian aesthetics to challenge hegemonic colonial understandings of wind. And that's very interesting, because sort of an aesthetic concept of wind and I guess related energy seems to be inherently a completely different type of concept to industrials, or you could say sort of economic understandings of the wind. And so initially it seems very interesting how sort of a disagreement between those could arise, since they're sort of so different in sort of type. Could you perhaps sort of explain how that could be?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So mentioned the natural resources issue and how this is linked to the colonization of the Sahara and the continued occupation. So Morocco is a leader in green energy at the moment, but the problematic thing about how it promotes its green energy achievements and plans is that a lot of these wind developments and solar developments are not in Morocco, they're in occupied Western Sahara. Right. So by 2030, I think about half of Morocco's envisaged wind capacity will be from the occupied territory. So I've been interested at looking at more into these developments, how they relate to energy politics, but also how the corporations behind these developments imagine the Saharan winds and the Sahara discursively. And so if we look at promotional videos by Siemens, for example, so Siemens Gamesa is one of the companies behind a lot of the wind developments in occupied Western Sahara. And from my perspective, the way they paint the Sahara and the people who live there is repeating the civilizing mission discourses that are so typical of European colonialism, the natives as barbaric and uncivilized and needing European help and European technological innovations to make capitalist use of their territory, and of the desert as a wasteland that is hostile and useless to everyone if it weren't for Siemens making use of the wind. And the way they use the sounds of the wind in these videos, like this howling gothic sound, the way that sand's depicted, it's horrible sandstorms engulfing everyone, and it's just a pain, and it's hostile and horrible. So on the one hand, I've been looking at how wind companies imagine the winds and the wind blown, so sand and so on, and the geological elements of the Sahara, which are shaped by the wind, Aeolian geomorphology, how companies use these to create these terra nullius discourses and this continued idea of a civilizing mission. And then on the other hand, I've been interested in how indigenous Sahrawis who've lived as nomads in this environment for centuries and centuries, how they imagine Saharan winds in a different way, and what that might mean for energy developments led by nomads and indigenous Sahrawis. And so one thing to say about poetry and Sahrawi culture, it's really central to Sahrawi culture and to daily life. So I've used the example of political candidates using poetry in their campaigns, but also teenagers with a love interest, they'll write a poem and text it to their love interest. It's normal and everyday, and everyone writes poetry, everyone recites it. And this comes from the nomadic tradition. So nomads can navigate incredibly well in the Sahara Desert, as you'll know. But something that helps them with their navigation is poetry. So it's an easy way to remember things that a nomad needs to know, not just for navigation, but also things like which plants you need to treat certain ailments of your camel, the histories and so on. It's all transmitted through poetry. So it had a really strong pedagogical role in nomadic culture. And what we see with the Saharan winds was these were important and useful elements for nomads. So they'd know the patterns of the wind very well, and they'd have different names to help identify them. So for example, one of the coastal winds, the Sahalia, it most of the time blows at night, and it always blows in a particular direction. So if you're navigating at night and you feel the wind on you, then you can tell which way is west. So they use the knowledge of the winds to navigate. They'd use it to know where to find water and forage for their camels. They'd use it in terms of the wind sound. You could hear a danger coming, so wind is like a sentinel. I can't understand fully all the ways that they use the wind, but basically,
whereas if you dropped Jamie in the desert, he would.
I would die very quickly.
Yeah, me too.
Hey, myself.
I try very hard. It sounds so cool.
You would run really, really fast and then slow down bit by bit.
Yeah, that's right.
No, but these sound almost like
it is fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. It's like almost unbelievable. Obviously, completely
it
believe you.
Yeah.
But
no, I know it's an incredible knowledge. Yeah. So basically, in traditional Sahrawi nomadic poetry, wind is very present, and I think aesthetically, it's reflected in the poetic features that poets use. Even those that have never known nomadism, they draw from that tradition to some extent. aesthetic tools like rhyme and assonance and how they reflect the sounds of the wind. This is my idea in describing this Aeolian aesthetic, these wind-infused aesthetics. And it paints a different picture of the wind. So it's not something that's useless and barbaric to repeat the European colonial language. So this poetry challenges the constructions of the Sahara and its winds that corporations put forward. And the poets that are writing, they're conscious of these developments and what they mean for Sahrawi self-determination. They're very politicized poets, so they know about Siemens. They're involved in campaigning, so it's not a sort of I don't think I'm imposing my interpretation of their poetry as resistance. It's from their perspective too.
I do want to very quickly read a few lines that really stood out to us when we were reading your paper. Really, really great paper, by the way.
Thank you.
Just for everyone who is listening, I just have the full title is Decolonizing Renewable Energy, Aeolian Aesthetics in the Poetry of Fatma Ghali Mohammed Salim and Limam Boysha. And in the concluding remarks, let me just quickly find that. There you go. There's a few lines that really, I guess, sum up quite well, I think, your paper, which is emerging from this culture are what I call Aeolian aesthetics, poetry and visual art informed by wind in their structures, motifs, imagery, and rhetorical devices. Aeolian aesthetics are characterized by a decided appeal to the senses through which we know the wind, sound and touch, and visions of the wind blown. On a political level, they undermine hegemonic understandings of energy, which make nature, in this case wind, something to be harnessed and dominated in order to power capitalism, colonialism. I found that, that's, I don't know, I feel like when we read this, something ticked a little bit for us.
Oh, thanks.
For both of us. You say, sorry, just a little bit more. The poets do so first by showing the wind's role as a creative force, both in the artistic sense and also in the geological sense. And then, I guess throughout the paper as well, you kind of just explain really well how this relation to the wind undermines the relations of capitalism and petrocultural society and just modern, like, Western, I guess, views of this. And I wonder how have you been able to talk about this and to show this kind of perspective to people who were let's say on the other side of the aisle, like on that petrocultural side, on that like more capitalist side, maybe people who are in charge of wind projects or something? And I wonder if you were able to, what the reaction has been to this, like to this kind of almost opposite, really, worldview, right?
Oh, well, because I still volunteer with Resource Watch, I am often trying to communicate with these corporations, but I've never got anywhere near encouraging them to read an article of mine. It's normally no response at all, or an occasional response every few months, perhaps. On one occasion at a conference, I did meet a representative of Siemens by coincidence. So at Durham University, this was a few years ago, there was a conference on carbon democracy. So Timothy Mitchell was the keynote speaker, and there were lots of papers around these issues, I suppose, of petroculture, oil and resistance and so on. And I talked a bit about some of my fieldwork in occupied Western Sahara and these energy developments, sort of the politics of the developments and how they fuel the occupation, in my opinion, and entrench them. And I didn't know there was a man from Siemens in the audience, because I think they have some partnerships at Durham University, and he said that there were no Siemens wind farms in occupied Western Sahara,
Okay.
which was not true. And I said immediately, well, I've seen them with my own eyes. They're certainly there. And then to that, he responded that he'd been there, and that the population of the territory consented to them, and that he'd been involved personally in the consultations.
Right. So if they're not, they don't exist, but if they do, people.
But actually, they do. So this is but this is generally the response we. So Resource Watch, following international law, we think, and through the presidents of various court cases specifically on resources from Western Sahara, you can't exploit the resources of an occupied country without the consent of the indigenous people of that country. So it's sort of
But what I mean, I guess, what is the punishing organization or body in that case? Because
I mean, perhaps it should be the UN. The UN did publish a legal opinion on this matter in 2002. So there were various oil companies which had agreements with Morocco to drill for oil onshore and offshore Western Sahara. The UN legal opinion was that this would be illegal if it was against the wishes and interests of the people of the territory. So there's always this discussion on who have you consulted with? How did you get Sahrawi consent? There's been a few court cases in the EU High Court, the High Court of England and Wales, High Court of South Africa, and the latest one was EU ruling that it has to be the Polisario who gives consent.
Right.
But what the companies always do is say they've consulted the local population, but if you consult the settler population, that's very different to consulting the indigenous population.
Yeah.
So,
and even the Polisario, I'm guessing, have, I don't know, without knowing the conflict, it's, in many of these types of conflicts, the elite ruling kind of class, well, the people at the top who are politically privileged then end up becoming some sort of like elite class that then agree to these kind of demands or principles or something with personal benefits involved. So then it doesn't become hard to get the local approval, if that means getting the approval from the elites, as long as you're willing to satisfy their wishes, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's no company has ever consulted with Polisario. Normally Polisario has expressly told them, please don't do this, but it's ignored. And as you say, who's responsible for policing this? The answer is no one bothers.
So I guess they're not even recognized as really as like representatives, so they can't become an elite in a sense.
Well, officially they're the only representative of the Sahrawi people for the UN. So the companies could consult with them, but they don't have any interest in doing so because their agreements are with Morocco. And as you say, there are often personal benefits involved. So with the fisheries, for example, so it's mostly the EU has fishery agreements with Morocco so that they can continue fishing in Western Sahara's waters. It's mostly Spanish vessels that benefit. And so apart from these licenses that are given to EU vessels, Morocco also has licenses which it gives to local elites. So there's a lot of powerful families in occupied Western Sahara that have a load of fishing licenses and they sublet them to make money. And with renewable energy, with the exception of one wind farm, which is owned by a cement factory, all the wind farms in occupied Western Sahara are owned by Mohammed VI or his company, basically. So
Right.
there's definitely financial interest there, as you say.
Yeah. And it's
Um,
interesting because I've been reading a lot about this kind of topics for my own thesis, like on the wind renewable energies and land grabbing, especially like green grabbing and stuff like that. But this seems like, I don't know, almost like another scale. Like usually the examples that I find from all sorts of different authors in the field are like examples of land grabbing at the scale of like, levels of towns or hectares and things like this. But this seems like, I mean, state nation level kind of grabbing of land. I mean, I guess, with the colonial relationship, that's just what happens. But I'm just interested in like, since you've done a lot of research on this topic specifically for years, would you qualify the relationship as colonial? Like, would you use that word?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all the traits you see in colonialism, and especially settler colonialism, you see in occupied Western Sahara. So
because I know it's quite a loaded word in a sense, and like a colony, and I don't know, people around the world, I guess, seem to think that today we live without colonial, in like a post-colonial period. But it seems like, well, no, there are still I know there are conflicts that some agree or disagree, but this seems like rather more obvious, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, so for the UN, Western Sahara is officially a colony. So it's the only and it's the only African country that's still on the UN Decolonization Committee's list of non-self-governing territories. So it's like, in official terms, it's a colony. But and from a legal side, you could debate, well, is it legally a Spanish colony? But in terms of practices, for me, it's an example of settler colonialism. So this attempt to eliminate the Sahrawi population first, napalming them, the mass slaughters and so on, and then moving a settler population into occupied Western Sahara. So Sahrawis are a very small minority in occupied Western Sahara now. And then the sort of cultural means of eliminating what it means to be Sahrawi. So, as I said, Sahrawis are traditionally nomads, but since 2010, Sahrawis are not allowed to pitch tents anymore, so they can't put up a tent anywhere.
Wow.
Often, if Sahrawis have camels that are slaughtered, it's really hard to be a nomad, basically.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think in the early years of the occupation in Morocco at the time, it was the years of lead, so it was a really oppressive time for Moroccans. It was even more so for Sahrawis. So it's just a utter terror, really. You couldn't, if you talked about Polisario or Western Sahara rather than the southern provinces, people would just be terrified to do that. Forced disappearances, really horrific time in terms of human rights, and this attempt to stamp out every differential trait of Sahrawis. So, as you know, we define our national identities by what we aren't. So for Sahrawis, it's important to celebrate what makes them Sahrawi and not Moroccan. So their traditional dress, speaking Hassaniya rather than Darija. So the first tactic, I think, of the Moroccan regime was to try and stamp out Sahrawi cultural markers. But as that wasn't successful, Sahrawis resisted. What we see since about 2007-ish, I think, is an attempt to make Moroccan settlers Sahrawi. So Morocco will pay people to study Hassaniya. It'll encourage them to wear a melifa, which is the Sahrawi women's traditional dress, and to identify as Sahrawi. So
is that like a kind of tactic to appear better than they are on the world stage? Or
I think it's I think it's a settler colonial tactic of eliminating Sahrawis as a different population by making the Sahara identity just one more identity
Right.
within multicultural Morocco.
Okay, I see.
So
Yeah.
it's like reverse settler colonialism or extreme cultural appropriation, maybe.
My
It's like
God,
a
yeah,
reverse
that's
assimilation or something.
Yeah, yeah. But assimilating
oof.
the settler population with the indigenous one rather than the normal way of doing it,
Yeah.
of forcing a migrant population to assimilate with
Mhm.
the host country.
And is there aim, do you think, to kind of to make what's the word, to make the Sahrawi culture much more like what do you call it? To add water to it?
Dilute it, yeah.
To
Yeah, I
dilute
think
it.
so.
There you go.
Yeah.
Sorry, my brain went bugged
No.
out for a second.
Yeah. So on the one hand, Sahrawis are oppressed if they express their own culture. So they might be mocked in school because their dialect sounds like a camel and insults like this, or chastised for speaking Hassaniya between themselves.
Mhm.
And they're not allowed to have cultural events where they recite their poetry and things like that. But then in southern Morocco, there'll be a Hassaniya cultural festival, and so it's more and more pushed in southern Morocco, so
Mhm.
that it becomes this one identity of many in
Yeah.
Morocco itself.
And it's kind of something that like you can maybe spot even, I don't know, like around the world, like even I'm just thinking in Europe, I don't know, obviously it's not the same level of scale or anything like that, but on the cultural kind of appropriation and pushback at the same time, like this double pronged approach, it reminds me a little bit of the way that like European countries can somehow simultaneously discourage people from, like, for example, Black British people from representing their culture through like dressing or even hairstyles, something as simple as that. But then at the same time, be those same places and people can be super proud of hosting like Black history events and things like that. And so it's like this kind of two things. Do you think that our society is also a little bit guilty of maybe not obviously as it's not as overt as this example of Morocco and Western Sahara?
Sorry. Yeah, that's a great example. That sounds really similar, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. That's,
And
it's exactly that.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about your article, Oppressive Energopolitics in Africa's Last Colony, that you wrote with Mahmoud Lemadel and Hamza Lakhal, for Antipode, which is, I have to say, one of my favorite journals. So super happy to have an Antipode scholar on the show. For anyone that is wishing to get a good dose of radical geography, Antipode is for sure one of the better journals out there. In this article, you talked about the way that Morocco uses energy as a tool to oppress, and I was wondering if you've experienced this yourself, basically, because you talked about things like power cuts, things like how the energy grid in general is basically weaponized by the settler state. Have you seen this for yourself?
Yeah, so the idea for the article came from researching my book, basically. So I stayed with in a friend's house over a summer, and one of the reasons Western Sahara is so unknown is it's not open to journalists or people that want to speak to Sahrawis. You can go as a tourist, as long as you don't ask anyone about Western Sahara or speak to Sahrawis. But it's really, basically, to do research there, I had to stay inside a house and not go near the windows. And
Right.
so so when I was there, there were power cuts and a lot of water cuts, and so I'd ask my host family about these, and they'd tell me about how power cuts are used as a form of collective punishment, basically, and this is where the idea from the article came from. And originally I hoped that I might be able to sort of do some sort of quantitative research on this as well, so somehow measure which power cuts happen when and how frequently, for how long, and which districts, and this just proved impossible. So in the article we focus on Sahrawi people's perspectives. So they perceive this to be used as a form of collective punishment, and that power cuts happen most frequently in the districts dominated by Sahrawis and around particular important political events. So, for example, if a political prisoner is freed or pardoned, there'll be a big party in their home city, and this is when a power cut will happen. Or if there's a lot of protests, then there'll be a power cut. So it's used to oppress political dissent, and also when there's to punish the Sahrawi population as well.
And collective punishment is absolutely illegal under, like, especially civilians like this. So I guess I don't know if qualitative research allows you to kind of pursue the legal paths. Would you need like quantitative data, like proof, like in quantitative way to I guess sue the Moroccan state for that?
Oh, possibly, yeah. But I mean, I think there's a lot of aspects of Moroccan rule in Western Sahara that would be illegal, and they're not held to account at all. So I doubt I'd try, but I guess because of the type of data that we had, we framed it in terms of perspectives and what that meant in terms of how people identify as citizens. So we felt that the way the energy system is used, it reinforces the boundary between feeling Sahrawi and identifying with Morocco. It's one more way of punishing the Sahrawi community as Sahrawis, which further how to put it, heartens people's minds and feelings towards Sahrawi Republic and identifying with Polisario and pro-independence sentiments.
Maybe we can just get into your book and slowly wrap it up.
Great. So the book was an exploration, I suppose, of how gender shapes authoritarianism, but also resistance, particularly non-violent resistance. And it focuses on Equatorial Guinea and Western Sahara, and looks at first at how Equatorial Guinean and Sahrawi women resisted Spanish colonialism, and their involvement in the non-violent nationalist movements pushing for independence in both cases, and the gendered elements of their resistance, and then after that it looks at similar questions, but with regards to Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara on the one hand, and the post-colonial authoritarian dictatorships in Equatorial Guinea on the other hand. And I develop an argument about resistance being intersectional, just as oppression is, and about gender washing. So this is the idea that companies and regimes paint themselves as state feminists or pro-gender equality to reinforce their own power, and how activists undermine that, I suppose.
So,
Yeah.
like, an interesting concept that runs through the book is the concept of imaginaries. And initially, I assumed that that was just sort of a very similar, or another word for just narratives or discourse, but it seems to be a bit more nuanced than that in reality.
So I'm interested in how people imagine gender and national identity, I suppose, as the big one in the book, and how national identities can be imagined as gendered too, and using examples from poetry sometimes as well, in both cases, and song. Excuse me. Yeah.
And so the kind of cases you address, so in Equatorial Guinea and Western Sahara, you say that the resistance movement in one case is dominated by women and the other by men. So just this kind of question of intersectionality, like why are those patterns there? And sort of, like how is this sort of gender-based oppression in each case like overlapping with other forms of oppression to make those patterns appear?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's hard to sort of draw a line between colonial and pre-colonial times. It's sort of but I'll attempt to anyway. I think with Sahrawis, for example, the way they construct their history when they look back, then talking about gender roles or gender imaginaries, as you said, politics has always been constructed as part of women's proper role. So Sahrawis will talk about their nomadic history and how women would take control of the camps, especially if men were away with the camels looking for pasture and so on. It's politics is seen as something that's naturally feminine, and Spanish colonialism in Spanish Sahara was very different, I think, to how it worked in Spanish Guinea. So in Spanish Guinea, there was a huge effort on the part of Spain to make the indigenous population Spanish. So there's Catholicism, most Equatorians are still Catholics today. Coercion, so things like in the classroom, if a Equatorian wasn't speaking Spanish, she'd be physically punished. A real strong attempt over centuries to kick out indigenous cultures and replace them with Spanish. A really strong cultural colonialism, and we didn't see that in Spanish Sahara. There was never any attempt to Catholicize the population. It was purely about extracting resources, and there wasn't an attempt to make Sahrawis into Spaniards in the same way that you see in other contexts. So Sahrawis, I suppose, have retained their pre-colonial culture to a much greater extent. They weren't oppressed in the same way culturally as the Ghanaians, and with Equatorial women, we have the Spanish Phalange's women's section, which existed in Spanish Sahara as well, but was sort of rejected. The women's section in Spanish Guinea would basically try to force Equatorial women to take on the Spanish Catholic housewife model of Franco's times and before. So gender norms there were shaped in a certain way, which made politics an improper activity for women. And it's still that way today. So there's a great article by Enrique Okemve, an academic historian, who's also an Equatorial activist, and he has a paper with a title in Fang, which I won't try to repeat, but he translates it as "you're bad mouthing, you're talking politics," so it's completely taboo for both genders today, really. But I think what we saw in the Spanish colonial era is that street protests, the pro-independence movements, were seemingly dominated by men because gender roles had made it that way. So the gender roles shaped by Spanish colonialism made it that way. But women were very much involved in the resistance. It's just that what we often understand to be resistance sometimes excludes forms of resistance that women use. So we'll focus on the very visible street protests or on the members of organized formal movements, and this makes women's resistance invisible or silenced, even if it existed, and it did exist in Spanish Guinea. And in the Sahara, on the other hand, women are very visibly part of resistance movements and the things that we typically associate with uncritical definitions of resistance, I suppose. So street protests, positions in organized political movements, and so on. So I think it stems from how colonialism did or didn't impact upon indigenous gender norms.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe just the final question. I don't know if you want to do one more, Skander. Just finally, so yeah, this concept of gender washing is very interesting, because I've been familiar with terms like greenwashing and not specifically gender washing before, and I wonder how. So in gender washing, I could say that these regimes are presenting a particular narrative of sort of liberty for women, or a certain conception of gender equality. How do they deal with sort of alternative, popular based and like progressive conceptions of gender equality that I would say are more authentic? How do they seek to sort of override and delegitimize those alternative narratives?
Yeah, well, in the Equatorial case, the way the regime markets itself inside Equatorial Guinea and abroad is sort of very pro gender equality, highlighting lots of projects for women's empowerment, but there's very little substance to them. It seems purely a PR exercise with almost no material effort at all. And when Equatorial feminists put forward new policies or laws or initiatives, sometimes they more or less manage some activities with very little support from the government, and sometimes they're directly oppressed. So there was a woman I met in my fieldwork, who I've anonymized in the book, but she worked for the Ministry of Social Affairs, but she'd been co-opted into the job, basically. So I think she'd retired to Equatorial Guinea after working for women's rights organizations in Spain for most of her life. And she didn't want this job, but she was basically told that she was doing it. And she's been very critical within the government of their record on gender equality, but started to receive death threats for criticizing them, basically. And she was pushing for a new family law, but just not only could she not get it passed, but she was receiving threats again for her efforts. So it's extremely hard for Equatorial feminists, basically. On the one hand, Obiang, the dictator, markets himself as pro-gender equality, but there's no efforts on his part, and the meaningful efforts are sort of actively oppressed. So with regards to Mohammed VI, I have to say, to be honest, I've never done any research in Morocco or Moroccan society. I've read some articles by Moroccan feminist academics who are critical of Mohammed VI's efforts, or sort of skeptical about his positioning of himself as sort of a state feminist and so on. But I don't know much about it. But in terms of occupied Western Sahara, the way women activists are treated, the sort of very gendered forms of violence that they're subjected to, for me, it really lays bare the hollowness of the Moroccan regime's claims of being pro-gender equality, at least in terms of their policies in Western Sahara.
Mm-hmm. So rather than sort of a public clash of two different narratives, it's more like the state narrative has a pretense that it's appealing to the popular narrative, but in reality isn't, and in private is actively fighting against it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, this pretext and in reality actively undermining it. I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're gonna potentially wrap it up now. Would that be all right, Jamie? Do you have
sure.
No? Yeah. Just because we have to unfortunately limit the length sometimes of episodes a little bit. So otherwise we get going for 2, 3, 4 hours and then people tune out. But yeah, Dr.
Thank
Joanna
you. I really
Allan,
enjoyed that.
Thank you
so nice
much
to have an opportunity to talk about my work in so much depth.
Of course.
Great questions. So thanks very much.
It's really unique stuff. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Like I have to say that the mix of aesthetics and politics like that is it's very unique.
Thanks very much.
But that was Dr. Joanna Allan from the University of Northumbria. And you can find her book. What was the exact title? Sorry, Silence Resistance.
Silence Resistance. Yeah.
I always, for all my academic books, I'm always terrible at remembering the second lines. You know, but silence resistance.
I can't remember the subtitle of my own book.
Yeah,
women dictatorships and gender washing in Western Sahara and Equatorial Guinea. Because I'm reading it out.
There we go. So that came out in 2019. But I guess if you're interested in reading this, you can find it online and order the book. Otherwise, there are plenty of articles that Joanna has authored and co-authored that you can have a look at. And yeah, we highly recommend, obviously, the two that we specifically mentioned today, the one on Aeolian aesthetics, which super cool word, by the way. And the other one on do you say energopolitics?
I think so. Yeah. I borrowed the term from Dominic Boyer's his work, so I think it's energopolitics.
Right. Okay. But yeah, thank you for helping us get definitely a clearer, better understanding of the region of Western Sahara, of Sahrawi culture as well, because like we said before, this is something we're really not acquainted with. And I have to say, it feels good to speak to someone who definitely knows her stuff, has worked on this, and so we feel like we are much more equipped with this kind of knowledge from at least as well as a safe source, because God knows it's difficult sometimes to get a hand on these complex conflicts and topics. But thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for coming on the show, and we hope to see your work online and around soon, and come back anytime there's other work that you want to talk about.
I'd love to. Thank you. I'd love to. It's been really nice to talk to you, Skander and Jamie.